Welcome back to the Broadman Word, and we are finally at the point where we are talking about the promised son, which is Isaac. Yes, Ishmael has been born from Abraham and Hagar, but all along we have been talking about the son of Abraham and Sarai, and I think it is important to see that that is finally coming about. But not only that, but we see a name change not just for Abram to Abraham, but Sarai to Sarah. So turn with me to Genesis chapter 15, back to Genesis chapter 15. We're going to start at verse 15 of chapter 17, sorry. So chapter 17, verse 15 of the book of Genesis. So chapter 17, verse 15. And God said to Abraham, As for Sarai your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. So you have the name change of Abram to Abraham, or exalted father to father of many nations, or father of a multitude. For Sarai to Sarah, it's only one letter difference, and so it shouldn't come as a shock that there's really not that much difference in the meaning. Sarai and Sarah both mean princess, and I think that is interesting because you do have this royalty of um, in mind when thinking of Abraham, because he is the patriarch, he is the father of the country of Israel, and so it makes sense why we think of Sarah as royalty as well, because she is the mother of Isaac. But to this point, she has not really been acting very much like a princess. She has been maybe a spoiled princess, but not a very good example of a princess. But now that will start to change. And it's interesting with how the Lord responds. You would think that the Lord would say, Look, I saw how she treated Hagar, and so therefore she does not deserve to have children, especially at the point where she is now, where she is 89 years old. But instead, he says this in verse 16. I will bless her, and moreover, I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she shall become nations. Kings of peoples shall come from her. And there's that royalty connection with the name of Sarah, and then what happens. But I think it's interesting, and this is another moment of grace by the Lord, isn't it? Where he says, even though that she deserves not to be blessed because of how she responded to Hagar, she gets blessed not just once but twice in this one verse in verse 16. I will bless her. And then a little bit on, I will bless her. And I think that's a really, really cool to see the grace of God in this moment towards not just Abraham, but to Sarah as well. And I think that's really, really cool to see. And so there's this continuing just promise that Sarai will bear children, even though that seems with every single passing day and year that's seeming more and more impossible to Abraham. Which is kind of the case. Look how Abraham responds to this blessing given by the Lord for Sarah. Verse 17. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said to himself, Shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? Um, at this point, because in verse 17 he states that, but then in verse 24 it says Abraham was 99 years old. So I think it's just more of the fact that he's probably getting close to his 100-year birthday, and Sarah could be 90, but if this is the right thing, she's probably 89, and she's getting close to her 90th birthday. So I just want to make sure that that's clear, why there's difference between verses 17 and 24 when it comes to the age of Abraham. But yeah, I mean, he falls to the ground, his face is on the ground, and he's laughing, and he says this to himself, and I think that's really, really important, that he's not just He's not just thinking this out loud, he is thinking this internally, and God knows that, which again shouldn't surprise us, but that God sees our internal struggles. That makes so much sense from what we know about the Lord and his character, right? Um, but then Abraham does respond out loud. Verse 18, and Abraham said to God, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. And I think Abraham here is not he's not showing favoritism because Ishmael is actually alive and a son that's actually alive. But I think he's looking out for his son Ishmael. Um, and the Lord states that, but he makes it clear too what's really going on. Verse 19, God said, no, but Sarah your wife shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his offspring after him. As for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I have blessed him and will make him fruitful and multiply him greatly. He shall father 12 princes, and I will make him into a great nation. But I will establish my covenant with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this time next year. So you see that the Lord is very much knowing that that Ishmael will turn into a nation. That's not up for debate, and we saw that with the interaction between the Lord and Hagar in chapter 16. So we've already seen that. So it's just important, I think, that Abraham hears that from the Lord. I'm sure Hagar probably told Abraham what the Lord said about Ishmael when she was in the wilderness. But I think it's important that the Lord says it himself to Abraham, that he is and he will care and look out for Ishmael. But he wants to make it clear that the covenant between him and Abraham is through the son that is to be, which is Isaac. And it's interesting too, the name Isaac, this is really the first time his name has come up. And that name is really, it means he laughs. And I think it's not just from the fact that Sarah's about to laugh when it comes to this promise very, very soon coming up. But the fact that Abraham is laughing about this, and again, it's not laughing because it's funny, which I mean, it kind of is funny thinking about an almost 90-year-old woman and almost 100-year-old man having a child. That is partially pretty. That is kind of funny to think about, but I think it's more the fact that it's just really like, are you kidding me? Is this really about to happen? I think that's kind of what's going through Abraham's mind, which leads him to laughter. And I think sometimes too, when you and I get into situations that seem just kind of nuts, that the Lord will work in them, we kind of have moments where we think about laughing, or we do laugh because it just seems like, what is going on? Uh, I mean, yeah. I mean, there are certain moments in my life where I've done that. It's like, Lord, I don't know how you're going to work in this situation, but it seems almost impossible. So, what are you going to do? Like, that's kind of how you respond sometimes, right? So, I think that's important to see that that's not just ourselves laughing at situations, but Abraham did that as well in a situation that is partially funny, but also just seems so impossible. And yet, a year from this time, in this passage here, a year later, it does come to pass. And so it's really, really cool to see that. But then finally, you got to see the seal of the covenant that was talked about in the first part of 17 that we talked about on Tuesday or last time. We see that being put into place. So even with this crazy promise that they're going to have this son, Abraham, yes, he's laughing about, but it's not like he just refuses that promise, because he then goes out and makes sure to do what the Lord has said. Verse 22, let's pick that up. When he had finished talking with him, God went up from Abraham. Then Abraham took Ishmael his son, and all those born in his house, or bought with his money, every male among the men of Abraham's house, and he circumcised the flesh of their foreskins that very day, as God had said to him. Abraham was 99 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, and Ishmael his son was 13 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. That very day, Abraham and his son Ishmael were circumcised. And all the men of his house, those born in the house and those bought with money from a foreigner, were circumcised with him. So you have this point where, first off, I think verse 22 is interesting. When he had finished talking with him, God went up from Abraham. So it's cool to see that Abraham was actually in the presence of God when he was talking to him about this promise. That's really cool to think about. But then you have Abraham not hesitating and taking into action the first part of 17. So this promise about Isaac is tacked on to the first part of 17. It's not like a time had passed between the first part of 17, the circumcision being introduced, and then the promise of Isaac. No, they follow right after each other. And so as soon as this talk about the promise is done, and the Lord leaves Abraham at this point, then Abraham does not hesitate and goes and puts into effect the seal of the covenant talked about in the first part of 17, which is circumcision. And just the faith that Abraham has there is really, really eye-opening and just really inspiring, to me at least. And so, yeah, I mean, that is really kind of where we're at with Abraham, which then leads to more talk about Isaac when it comes to chapter 18, which we'll get at next week. But then it starts to lead into a really big conversation, which is about Sodom and Gomorrah. And we'll see Abraham's relationship with Sodom and Gomorrah, and then we'll actually talk about Sodom and Gomorrah separately from Abraham. We'll take a break and talk about Sodom and Gomorrah a little bit. So that is where we are going, and I hope to see you then. However, I'll see you with the Broadman Word tomorrow as well. Thanks.